Warning, this video contains spoilers for Doki Doki Literature Club, Yume Nikki, Irisu Syndrome, Eversion, and Kimi to Kanojo no Koi. On December 10th, Doki Doki Literature Club developer Dan Salvato confirmed that his game had reached 1 million downloads. How does a seemingly generic, cutesy dating sim of all games garner so much attention? Doki Doki is a game within a game. What you thought was a dating sim is actually a meta-horror evolving over 3 acts. Doki Doki is also an amalgamation of visual novels, horror, metafiction, and trope subversion that owes a lot to games like Irisu Syndrome and the visual novel genre as a whole. Its success may be equally based on how accessible it is, especially when compared to your typical visual novel. So, settle down because this may all take a while to unpack, because we're going to dive deep into what makes Doki Doki Literature Club so interesting. Immediately the game hits us with a content disclaimer. It's a little unfortunate that this disclaimer has to be present, since it can overly foreshadow the genre shift. This game does cover some pretty heavy themes, however, so I agree with its inclusion. Not to mention that so many people found this game through word of mouth, it's unlikely that any significant portion of the player base went in truly blind. This could even be a positive factor, in that players may find themselves on guard to begin with, but have their defenses eroded by the slow nature of Act 1. Or it could keep a player who normally finds themselves bored by visual novels going just a little bit longer in order to see what the disclaimer was all about. The game proper begins with Sayori, the player's childhood friend, asking him to join a club at school. Anyone with passing familiarity with visual novels, anime, or Japanese culture may see what's coming and already find themselves groaning, but you have to be willing to be beaten over the head with these tropes in order to experience the payoff. We are then given a quick introduction to the 4 girls who comprise the literature club. We have Natsuki, the tsundere, Sayori, the girl next door, Yuri, the shy girl, and Monika, the class president. We can already see that Monika stands out in a few ways. Her trope isn't as obvious, even though later we will learn that she is a yandere, a popular character trope in which one character is psychotically in love with another, usually the protagonist, to the point where that love manifests as destructive. Also, you may not have noticed it after you've read the names 1,000 times, but Monika's name also stands out as a nice little bit of foreshadowing. It's definitely less Japanese sounding than the other girls. You can even extend this brief foreshadowing to her hair color. Monika's brown looks the most natural. Sayori's is passable, but Yuri and Natsuki look like they're right out of one of my Japanese animes. This type of foreshadowing, along with the upcoming poetry, is nice in Doki Doki, since the way the endings are laid out, there's no need to do another fresh playthrough. These instances of foreshadowing can freshen up the experience if you ever decide to go back to it in the future. After being welcomed into the club, we are introduced to the poetry minigame. I think the minigame is pretty weak overall, although picking a word like unstable and seeing who reacts to it is a nice way to let the player choose their own hints as to what's really going on with the girls. But after the first 2 times I found myself wanting to fast forward through it and just select my chosen route. The next day at the Literature Club, we are given our first scene with whichever girl our poetry resonates with most. If Doki Doki hadn't already convinced you that you're in for a painfully generic dating sim experience by now, then this is your wake-up call. A standoffish girl like Natsuki will begin to open her heart to the protagonist simply because they both like manga. Yuri, a shy girl who seems to have trouble interacting with others, does a 180 and is excited to be around the main character because he's willing to read a book. Sayori's route is a little more believable, but the air still stinks of that dating sim protagonist magic. Speaking of, it's as good a time as any to bring up the protagonist, because it's not just the girls who are trope characters. The dating sim protagonist is one of the many genre tropes that Doki Doki looks to point out. The protagonist is immediately the object of attention in the entire literature club. He can easily get any girl's romantic attention because he's the only romantic actor in their limited lives. Girls typically don't form friendships with the dating sim protagonist because that's not what the target audience is after. It's a dating sim, not a friendship sim. This is because the genre is typically associated with wish fulfillment and escapism. It's also why we don't see pictures of the protagonist or why he doesn't take strong opinions on anything. If he looked different or thought radically different than the player, it may hamper their ability to self-insert. This is also likely why the protagonist doesn't produce full poems like the girls do. We need him to be as blank a slate as possible. So after we have our first scene with our route flag girl, we get into what I think is Doki Doki's strongest storytelling mechanic, the poetry. The poems in Doki Doki serve to establish a connection with the girls and to deliver some well-done foreshadowing. Let's do some quick poetry analysis to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Sayori's first poem, Dear Sunshine, mentions that she would sleep forever if not for the sun waking her up. Upon first playthrough, this is just a cute poem about wanting to sleep in sometimes. In actuality, this is the first we hear of Sayori's problem with depression. This is echoed in her poem titled Bottles. Her happy thought bottles read to me, given our future knowledge of her mental condition, like a pretty on-the-nose metaphor for antidepressants. Maybe I'm just dense, but like Dear Sunshine, this passed right over me during my first playthrough. Yuri's poem, The Raccoon, is an extended allegory for habit. The raccoon represents her urge to self-harm, and the bread is the physical act of her cutting herself. Much like Sayori's poem, this can be read innocently enough at first, but with proper context, the meaning almost seems to jump in your face with a sign reading mental issues on it. Monika's poem, Hole in Wall, is maybe the most obvious of them all, and this fits with Monika's attempt to reach out and communicate directly with the player. Her usage of the phrase, infinite choices, is repeated throughout the game in the credit song. It refers to her desire to escape the game in which everything is programmed and predestined, unlike the real world outside of it. Nobody who has beaten the game can possibly read the last half of this poem as anything but Monika's attempt to reference the player themselves. This poem will be altered in Act 2 as Monika realizes she is unable to get the player's attention due to her lacking a proper route. Natsuki's poems seem innocent enough comparatively. I think it's a combination of me personally enjoying her poems the most, and Natsuki being the most underdeveloped character, that leaves me without any deeper themes to glean from her poems. If you personally have any theories or analysis, I would love to hear about them in the comments section. The game then plays out a few more poems and minor scenes, and you eventually choose to spend a day with a girl outside of the literature club. The player is made aware of Sayori's depression when he visits her house on his way home. This scene hits pretty hard because it's so different than the rest of the game up until this point. So far, we have been in an idealistic dating sim environment with clean, archetypical characters. So for one of them to exhibit actual depth, takes the player by surprise whether they realize this or not. This basic trope subversion is the structural support that allows Salvato to deliver his horror. The solo date with the girl of your choice is, once again, back to the typical dating sim fare. The protagonist and the girl find themselves closer together, maybe share a cute moment, and the romance begins to grow. It's not entirely a throwaway event, however, as Doki Doki still squeezes in a bit of foreshadowing into some of these scenes, such as Yuri's knife fascination. What is much more interesting about this day is what happens immediately after the dating scene. Sayori encounters the protagonist and confesses her love for him. Whether the player accepts or denies her confession, Sayori is dead the moment she confesses. This is because the typical end state of a girl's route in a dating sim is the love confession. Doki Doki takes this trope to the extreme by having a girl who has confessed her love to the main character not only have their route end, but also their life. If there is any doubt in the player's mind as to whether Monika was different than the other girls, it will be erased during the next day. She somehow has knowledge of the exchange between you and Sayori and makes a pretty mortifying joke about Sayori's soon-to-be-revealed method of suicide. Combining this with Sayori's poem, in which she only repeats, "Get out of my head," we find the exact moment we transition from poking fun at dating sims to the full-on meta-horror experience. What follows is probably the most well-known scene in Doki Doki. The protagonist finds Sayori hanging in her room, having committed suicide after her confession. This event is clearly not supposed to happen in this type of world. Having a route girl kill herself, even after you commit to her completely, is just unheard of in the typical dating sim. It's actually such a horrific event that we see the game script begin to break and we get our first ending. When we return to the title screen, there are some obvious differences. Sayori's photo is replaced with a glitched version, mostly resembling Monika, and the new game text is gibberish. I actually think this is one of the smartest moments in Doki Doki, even though it happens outside of the narrative. Many players who are new to visual novels are unfamiliar with the routes and multiple endings concepts that are often employed. Oftentimes, players who are new to the genre will find themselves beating a visual novel once and saying, "That's it?" The garbled text in place of the new game button draws the player's attention, telling them that this is clearly different than before and you must click it because your curiosity demands it. When the game starts back up, we quickly realize that Sayori has been removed from the game entirely, and it becomes Monika's job to introduce us to the literature club. Throughout Act 2, we will see the results of broken game code in the form of visual glitches and musical distortion. This can lead to some of the more visceral scares the scene provides in the form of Yuri's photorealistic eyes or Natsuki's broken neck jump scare scene. At this point, we are done playing around with dating sim tropes and all aboard the horror train. This is because the dating sim archetypes begin to break down as the characters are built up. We learn more about their negative traits and abandon the idealistic dating sim that was the majority of Act 1. We learn that Natsuki is malnourished and likely abused by her father, and that Yuri has an obsessive personality and cuts herself. These very real issues would hit too close to home for many players, making them unfit for your standard dating sim. Monika's role expands in the act as well, as she interrupts scenes with a girl of your choice and attempts to steer the player in her direction. The argument between Yuri and Natsuki has her break the fourth wall entirely and step in front of the dialogue box. We can even see Monika's sprite jump up sometimes during the poetry minigame, showing that she's watching even though she's not a route option, or that there is no narrative actually taking place. Also, be sure to check the game folder during this section for a mechanic lifted from Irisu syndrome. As the game goes on, Monika leaves messages for the player in the form of notepad files, trying desperately to communicate with him when the structure of the game doesn't allow her to. Another thing that becomes apparent throughout Act 2 is that Monika has been and continues to amplify the negative traits of the girls in an attempt to drive you away from them. By amplifying these traits to an extreme level, they become impossible for the protagonist to solve. It's a common dating sim trope for the girl in any given route to have a problem. The main character will solve it, and this will solidify their relationship. If Doki Doki were played straight, the conclusion of Yuri's route would likely be that the protagonist, and their love for each other, has removed her desire to self-harm entirely. Therefore, Monika's method is twofold in approach. She wants the player to feel disgust at Yuri's behavior, and at the same time feel impotent and unable to help her. No matter how much the player or protagonist may care for the girls, their fates are sealed. Act 2 also sees an evolution to the protagonist. He seems to speak less in this section. Any dialogue new to this act is short and to the point. Whereas the protagonist had a shocked reaction at the death of Sayori, he has nothing to say about Yuri's suicide. This will fully manifest during Act 3, when the protagonist has been broken down entirely, leaving Monika addressing the player themselves. Since the player is obviously unable to communicate directly with the game, there is no dialogue aside from Monika during Act 3. Act 2 climaxes with Yuri's death, in which the player must skip through a mass of garbled text as a result of the game script breaking once again. Here we see Monika accessing the game code and deleting Yuri and Natsuki as if they never mattered. That is, because according to Monika, they didn't. Shortly after, Monika resets the game, and we begin Act 3. It is worth noting here that there is no Natsuki route for players during Act 2. No matter how hard you try, you will be forced onto the Yuri route. I'm not sure why this is. It almost feels like cut content. There are certainly horrific themes you could touch on throughout a Natsuki corruption route, such as parental abuse and malnutrition, but the game omits these possibilities entirely. Act 3 is the shortest act, but serves to recontextualize the entire game. The meta elements are all fully revealed and plenty of horrific implications can be drawn. You see, Act 1 set us up with intentionally tropish characters that, if you're familiar with similar types of weeb trash, may be hard to care for since we've seen them so many times. Sayori, during the last third of Act 1, and Yuri, during Act 2, puts us in a different perspective, as we are introduced to these perfect anime stereotypes, revealing their very real and human problems. This makes us instantly relate and care for them in a way that 1,000 Act 1 dates never would have. The big reveal of Act 3, of course, is that they matter even less now than they did as trope characters during Act 1. They started out barely human, became much more human, and now, during Act 3, we find out that, since this is a video game, these girls are completely unrelatable and simply code acting out a script. These three levels of understanding are at the core of what makes Doki Doki Literature Club both a fascinating and terrifying experience. We are shown plenty of other meta moments here intended to scare the player, such as the fact that Monika wrote the Steam store game page, or that she knows the name of your computer, or even that she can tell if you're recording or streaming through OBS. After this initial dialogue, Monika will cycle through different discussion topics for as long as you leave the game open. There are over 50 topics, and I recommend you give them a read on the Doki Doki Wiki sometime, as they can be pretty interesting. Some topics demonstrate that Monika may show a hint of remorse, even though the other girls were never real. while one has her grotesquely describe Sayori's suicide as a clumsy attempt and laughing about it. Other topics have Monica acting as a mouthpiece for Savato as he opines on various topics. The topic most relevant to Doki Doki's overall message, however, has to be topic number 22. It's a discussion about stock characters and how they clearly cannot and do not exist in the real world. That having overly cute characters in these dating sims may be appealing on the surface level, but the lack of substance always is in the back of your mind. The cutesy image the game puts forth during Act 1 was only meant to draw players in and churn them out disgusted and disturbed by Act 3. Act 3 eventually ends when you choose to delete Monica's character file. You will then be treated to a short epilogue in which Sayori becomes the class president, experiences the self-aware existential angst that Monica did, and then Monica will end the literature club for good, as there is no permutation that will result in happiness for the player. Unless you got the secret ending, of course, in which you are then treated to a letter by Dan Salvato himself. He states his love of visual novels and games that subvert expectations. He says that as long as you enjoy yourself, even if you're playing a generic, soulless, wish fulfillment simulator, that's all that matters. While that's certainly a valid opinion to have, and I probably agree with it, it can serve to undercut some of the Act 3 revelations and criticisms throughout the game. However, it may have felt important to Salvato that he tells us he's not passing any sort of moral judgment, just encouraging some introspection. Doki Doki Literature Club owes a lot to the visual novel genre and dating sims as a whole. It uses subversion of these genre tropes as an effective vehicle for it to deliver a meta-horror themed plot. It's safe to say that Doki Doki would never be as successful as it is, though, without standing on the shoulders of giants. Let's look at a few of those influences. In an interview with Kotaku shortly after the release of Doki Doki Literature Club, Dan Salvato laid out a few of his influences. He said that people might go into Doki Doki Literature Club making fun of it as an anime trope game, only to find themselves caring about the characters and possibly very scared of them. This is consistent with the 3 levels of feelings the player is made to experience throughout the 3 acts. He then cites 3 specific games that inspired the atmosphere of the Literature Club. These games are Yume Nikki, Eversion, and Irisu Syndrome. Yume Nikki is a well-known game about a hikikomori, a shut-in who explores a world of her dreams every night when she goes to bed. It's truly a statement on the power of video games as a medium that 2 games who have polar opposite gameplay styles can seek to evoke similar feelings in the player. There is no dialogue in Yume Nikki, and the entirety of the gameplay comes from exploring bizarre dream worlds with only a faint idea of your end goal. As Yume Nikki is a game about dreams, it is even more open to interpretation than one primarily about poetry, and would easily require a video of its own to fully unpack. I will say that many of the graphical distortions throughout Act 2 of Doki Doki reminds me of some of the imagery throughout Yume Nikki, such as the spooky version of Yuri during the poetry minigame resembling the Uboa. Although maybe it's no coincidence that heroines from each game sleep all day and then kill themselves. Eversion is a platformer that has its main character shifting between worlds in order to solve puzzles. As the character continues shifting, the world becomes more and more disturbing. The game is rather short, so I recommend trying it yourself if you're curious about it. I personally didn't find too many similarities to Doki Doki, other than basic subversion of expectation that forms the bedrock of the Literature Club. The game we really need to talk about is Irisu Syndrome. This obscure Japanese puzzle game features a girl staring into the screen behind a series of falling blocks. After you lose, you are treated to a short scene and a bit of text. The story is difficult to make out to say the least. After you lose enough times, however, you are treated to the bad ending, in which some of the children are presumed to have been murdered. Upon opening the game folder, we can immediately see an element Doki Doki has taken from this title. The main character of Irisu Syndrome will not say a word during the game, but instead places note files inside the game folder in order to communicate the story. Sound familiar? Let's check for other similarities. Cute characters accompanied by horrific imagery. Check. Meta storytelling elements. Check. Sudden genre shift into horror? Check. I really recommend you play Irisu Syndrome yourself. It only takes maybe 2 hours to get through, and as you can see, I'm terrible at puzzle games. I've even left out the best parts of the horror scenes as well, so you'll really have to play it yourself to appreciate it. There is one game that Dan Salvato did not mention that we would do ourselves a disservice to not discuss. The specter that looms over any discussion of Doki Doki Literature Club, attempting to reduce the game to a worthless imitation. I'm talking about, of course, Kimi to Kanojo no Koi. also known as Totano. Totano is a visual novel from Nitro Plus, the company that gave us visual novels such as Sayano Uta, Steins Gate, and Chaos Head, just to name a few. Totano is a game that seeks to be a full-on deconstruction of the dating sim genre. It features two potential love interests, the childhood friend Miyuki and the stranger Aoi. Let's see if any of this sounds familiar to you. One of the primary heroines of the game, Miyuki, becomes self-aware and rewrites the game code, preventing the player from dating the other route options. Did I mention that she's aware of the other timelines, meaning that she remembers every playthrough of the game you've done? This game makes it deliberately difficult to reach Aoi's route, and you will find yourself finishing Miyuki's route several times, confessing true love for each other at every end. When you do finally reach the Aoi ending, Miyuki demonstrates a psychotic love for the player, murdering Aoi, admonishing the player for cheating on her, and rewrites the game code. The result of this is a world in which they are alone together forever. Is this ringing any bells yet? This is not the whole story, of course, but many people would tell you that it is. That is because the only scene of Totano available in English is the Miyuki ending on YouTube, in which she goes full Monica, killing Aoi and rewriting the game script. This 15 minutes is what most people assume Totano is all about. We should remember, of course, that Totano is on average 4 to 5 times longer than Doki Doki Literature Club and requires many playthroughs in order to access the routes. Salvato even tweeted that he had seen the ending clip on YouTube after he finished conceptualizing the game. This is believable because there are just as many differences between Totano and the Literature Club as there are similarities. For example, the character of Aoi has no parallel within the Literature Club. A character who knows she's in a visual novel and is fine with it. She accepts that as part of her nature. There are a few points in the story in which she must have sex with characters in order to survive, saying that without H scenes, she may run out of energy and disappear entirely. This is of course a statement on the dating sim genre, in which Japanese writers feel forced to include sex scenes if they want to make it out of publishing. Aoi also openly talks about flags, the keys that unlock progress along a girl's route in a dating sim. The entire game, Aoi exists almost purely to remind you that this is a dating sim and it is absurd. The entire reason Miyuki is hopelessly in love with the player is not because she was programmed to by the developer, like Monica was, but because Aoi altered her flags on request of the protagonist. This prevented her from falling in love with anyone else, all because he was jealous that she may kiss another boy during a school play. Once again, this is a statement on dating sims and waifu culture, the possessive nature of fans, the expectation of being the central romantic focus, and the purity of their waifu. This becomes one of the most powerful statements of Totano when you start to think about it. You see, in the Literature Club we don't get to see what happens to Yuri when we choose Natsuki's route, because the timeline resets itself. Would she continue her self-harm until it spirals out of control? It seems likely since her life outside the protagonist is non-existent. Totano forces us to consider what happens to Miyuki if the Aoi route had gone through. She clearly would have been alone and hopelessly in love forever. This is where the central themes of Totano and Doki Doki begin to diverge. Act 3 Monica would tell you that they are not real and not worth considering. It's only a game after all. One of Totano's endings challenges us to question that if those experiences are valuable to us and worth considering, do we then have to consider the consequences of those experiences? For example, for every girl you choose in a dating sim, there are often many who do not receive the love of the protagonist on that particular playthrough, and if you're willing to extrapolate what the rest of their life within game would look like, it quickly becomes a very bleak picture. This is why I would classify Totano as a full-on deconstruction of the genre and its mechanics, while Doki Doki simply uses subversion of trope characters in order to reach its goals. It's a small distinction between a subversive game and a deconstruction, but I think it's an important one. In the end, I would like to reiterate that both games use similar themes but have very different goals in mind. Doki Doki uses subversion of tropes as a vehicle to deliver a powerful meta-horror story that leaves us questioning the nature of what certain realities are worth. Totano uses meta-horror elements, such as the Miyuki time loop, or the fact that she abandons text entirely in favor of speaking directly to the player in order to hammer home its deconstruction of the dating sim genre. Both leave us rethinking how we interact with characters in video games, especially dating sims, but with very different interpretations. Should we disregard them as they do not exist, or should we be more conscious of how our games are designed, in a way that suffering for many characters seems inevitable? Doki Doki Literature Club exists in the sweet spot between Irisu syndrome and Kimi to Kanojo no Koi. It's not as simple a story as Irisu, but not as complex as Totano. It takes elements from both games and combines them into a hybrid experience. There's nothing wrong with lifting elements from other games, especially when you nail the execution as well as the Literature Club did. Doki Doki also falls between the two games in another important metric, that being length. Doki Doki Literature Club is on its way to being one of the most well-known visual novels to Western audiences, if it hasn't already reached that status. 1 million downloads is a ton for a genre such as visual novels. This makes it over 10 times as popular as Higurashi and almost 100 times more popular than the Nominary games, according to Steam Spot numbers. While it's somewhat misleading because these games have been published on other platforms, the difference is so massive I think there's still something to be gained from these numbers. We have to ask how this even happened. One of the most important factors for Doki Doki's success is accessibility. Many visual novels are not even natively available in English, like the aforementioned Totano, and immediately lock themselves off from the Western audience. The game is also free, so there's no reason to not give it a try other than fear of wasting your time. Speaking of time, I think that's the most important of these accessibility factors. I got through Doki Doki Literature Club in about 3 hours. I can see an average length being around 4, and this is backed up by how long to beat. This is incredibly short for visual novels. Looking at other popular visual novels, we see that Higurashi takes around 45 hours, 999 takes about 20, and visual novel darling Fate's Stay Night can take almost 100 hours to complete every route. If you're looking to break into the genre, there's a clear lack of easily digestible material to help players acquire a taste for visual novels. Doki Doki also succeeds by having something for every fan across the visual novel spectrum. Someone who is new to the genre may be entranced by the waifu elements and the idealistic world they inhabit. If you have a decent familiarity with anime or video games, you may have played Undertale or watched Madoka Magica, and you know Subversion when you see it. Visual novel veterans may find themselves picking up on the commentary littered throughout Act 1, only to end up appreciating the twist even more due to their intimate understanding of the genre. I think the meta-horror elements will appeal to players regardless of how much they care for visual novels, much like how Undertale did, even if you weren't at all familiar with Earthbound-style games. This combination of being short enough to beat in a sitting or two, having something for everyone, and a human appetite for something that can horrify us, helped to catapult its popularity. The game quickly took hold in many gaming forums and attracted some of the most popular gaming YouTubers to do entire playthroughs. This of course exposes that YouTuber's entire audience to the game, and it begins to grow exponentially. This is likely how we arrived at the 1 million mark. It seems clear that many who find themselves playing Doki Doki Literature Club are new to the genre. I assume this because of the sheer number of people who seem to play it compared to other popular visual novels. Time will tell what percentage of these players will become new converts and seek out other visual novels that may offer a longer and more in-depth experience. In the end, Doki Doki Literature Club is a great visual novel with interesting themes, and it succeeds in what it sets out to do. I myself have and have witnessed others go through 3 distinct stages of how they feel about Doki Doki Literature Club. The first stage of understanding comes after you finish the game. You think it's amazing. This honeymoon phase after finishing a new game is not unique to Doki Doki. The second stage is a reaction to the first. You may find yourself angry that Doki Doki gets so much attention compared to other visual novels, even when these themes have been touched on before or other visual novels are almost objectively better written. It's phase 2 that I find a lot of players get stuck at. Maybe they watched the ending to Totano on YouTube and have decided that this game is simply derivative, or they dismiss Doki Doki as just ironic weeb trash instead of an actual commentary on the genre. I hope this video has helped you understand the thesis, the antithesis, and to reach synthesis, or stage 3 of understanding. Doki Doki is not the greatest visual novel ever made, but it is an interesting amalgamation of themes the genre has built up over decades. Doki Doki is not as well written as many other visual novels and relies on a horror gimmick, but it executes that gimmick well and paces itself accordingly. I feel it's safe to say that Doki Doki Literature Club succeeds in being a horror story, a critique, a concise experience, and a love letter to all visual novels.